Well, I see from the wrinkles on my sleeve that we didn't even make it an entire week into this scat screenplay before things went to heck. I wonder if Jack and the boys have any thought about this. You know, if I hadn't already decided to redo the entire script because it was way too long and meandery, I'd be really irritated right now. But instead, I'm just really irritated right now because these idiots are trying to kill us all. Speaking of killing us all, we were going to talk about law enforcement, government, and their proper usage and purpose, and we still will. Later. There was a secondary concern in that subject that we had intended to cover within, but recent events in the capital being what they are, we decided to take a greater focus on it. So, next time, we're going to talk about, law enforcement, so on, form and function. For now, let's talk of endings. All things end. Indeed, one of the few apparent constants of the universe is the tendency of energy to be finite, and with it the ability to do things. The universe appears to prefer stillness and silence, and though we try to resist it, we are ultimately powerless to do so. From a philosophical standpoint, the question of whether or not existing is an action is still a matter of debate, but scientifically the answer is a little more clear. In fact, life can be somewhat hyperbolically summarized as a cascade of explosions attempting to keep itself going for as long as possible, although that's getting a tad more microbiological than we really need to for our purposes. The point is that nothing that exists forever. Every structure will eventually collapse, every system will eventually be corrupted or circumvented, every machine will eventually malfunction or break and have to be repaired. Feudal, capitalist, communist, monarchy, democracy, theocracy, regardless of the flavors of theory from which your government is constructed, it will always eventually fall. It may fall in many different forms. It could come in the form of outside invaders or internal usurpers, a civil war or revolts, or just good old-fashioned complete societal fracture. But it will happen eventually. Well, that's depressing. Wait, but if you talked with us for a while concerning our previously stated goals of encouraging communication, cooperation, and clarity, you would discover that among them is the hope that such things can help the government to be salvaged and perhaps put on the, right track, or at least a better one. And that may seem at odds with our apparent lack of faith in their trustworthiness and general certainty that they will collapse. And if you asked about that conflict, I would tell you that any government that cannot be saved shouldn't be. But you should always try as hard as you can to be certain that it cannot be saved, because that collapse and transition period is generally unpleasant for everyone involved. Especially given the general lack of awareness among Americans as to the world and our standing therein. Let's look at those types of collapse through the lens of the US, shall we? The first was outside invasion, presumably followed by subjugation under the invaders or a puppet government, which is really the same thing. This is unlikely to befall the US because, well, let me be perfectly clear. Topographically speaking, the US is tactical bullshit. On one side, you have the biggest ocean on the planet. On the other side, the second biggest. Almost immediately after making landfall from either direction, you hit a mountain range that goes coast to coast and is inhabited, as they tend to be, by the hill people. Now, the hill people tend to become hill people because they don't like being controlled, and it's very hard to control people that live amidst giant, innavigable rocks. So, maintaining supply lines is going to be a challenge, and that's before you take into account the sporadically armed populace that's capable of apocalyptic degrees of pettiness, or the fact that immediately following the biggest ocean on the planet and a big-ass mountain range is an equally big-ass desert. Pretty much the only hope that any invasion has is if Canada or Mexico allows them to pass through. Or is the invaders. But suppose that despite the uncooperative geography, the populace that hates you on principle regardless of how they feel about one another, and our military being 7 shades of needlessly overpowered, you still managed to conquer the place. Congratulations. Bully for you. You probably won't be sticking around for very long, because you're quickly going to run into the same problem that our current government is having, which your presence and path has almost certainly made worse. The US is kinda too big to effectively govern. Yeah, there are countries with more land in their borders or more people living within them, but if you look at maps by population center, you'll notice that the variety of terrain and just general extent to which we are spread out across it is frankly ridiculous, to the point that the costs of attempting to occupy the territory could easily outpace the costs of actually conquering it. So, invasion for conquest is unlikely, although not the only reason to attack an enemy. One of the big things Americans don't seem to be aware of about America is that we have economic rivals who would be delighted to see us crippled and unable to stop them from surpassing us. The main reason they don't try to make that a thing is because the combination of our ridiculous military and foundation of extravagant wealth means that it's often more beneficial for everyone involved to just maintain peaceful trade relations. However, if something were to damage that foundation, or destroy it entirely, those numbers could easily flip, and then there's no reason to maintain trade relations or even invade, just deliver a quick strike to keep us down and out of the way. Internal usurpers are pretty much exactly what they sound like. People from within the government that attempt to wrest it away from its expressed goals and duties. The US was actually specifically designed to prevent this from happening with some success. It wasn't perfect, and the past 200 years of the powerful struggling against their mandate really hasn't helped. The main problem that the US has, though, is actually the same weakness shared by most republics and democracies: the people's fear. The play usually goes that a leader will speak of grave threats to the nation, say drug dealers from across the southern border, or sex traffickers among their political rivals. And then they'll promise to protect the people from those dangers, and in exchange for this security, the people will give up more and more of their liberties until one day they, suddenly realize they don't have any more. It doesn't always go that way. Sometimes it can go in the other direction. Sometimes instead of tricking the people into surrendering their liberties, they're tricked into abusing them and giving an excuse to take them away. Regardless, attempts at this are, thankfully, fairly easy to spot. When attempting to control, lead, direct, or otherwise govern a large group of people, you can try to reason with them, but that only works insofar as they understand your point, and you will rarely have time to explain it. You can try to appeal to their sense of morality, but like reasoning with them, that works wonderfully when they agree with you, and not at all when they do not. You can attempt to appeal to their sense of community and duty to it, and that's probably the best approach to take when you can swing it, but is very situational. Finally, you can try to appeal to their baser emotions, such as fear and anger. This is very, very simple to do and supremely idiotic, because anger in a large group quickly turns to rage, turns to wrath, and fear in a large group is never more than a stiff breeze away from blind panic. Such strategies can be used to weaponize the populace against your political rivals for whatever reason. Perhaps to force a crisis situation to meet the necessary requirements to gain emergency powers. But such things need to be maintained very closely so that the crowd doesn't jump the gun or turn on you, which it almost certainly will at some point. In any case, whenever you hear a leader of any type speaking, pay close attention to their words. If it sounds like they're trying to inspire you to fear or anger, then either they're trying to manipulate you, or they're too stupid to understand why that's a bad idea. And either way, aren't worth your time. Decent leaders attempt to make things make sense, and when they can't do that, they attempt to reassure their people that it's fine, it's not their problem, and they've got it handled. Good leaders then go on to handle it. Tolerate nothing less. There seems to be some confusion on the next couple, so to clarify, a civil war specifically occurs when a group of people, often but not always current or former government officials, forms their own splinter government and breaks away from the original to go do their own thing, or maybe try to replace the original. A revolt occurs when the people rise up and attempt to overthrow their government. So, unless this guy wants to declare himself president of the Garbage Vikings, the clusterfuck on the 6th was at most an attempted revolt. I didn't really want to spend much time on this subject because civil war or revolt, the net result of a rebellion, would be really, really bad for everyone involved and should really just be avoided. But I've heard enough wild misconceptions about how a civil war would go that, well, we figured it could use a little bit of addressing. So, the main thing to keep in mind is that since the 1860s, construction materials have shifted a lot away from wooden brick to steel and concrete, weapons technology has gotten several orders of magnitude more destructive, and governments have shifted their focus to being increasingly economical. Indeed, in a world in which most modern militaries can completely annihilate a population center in a couple of days, the threat of the people rising up in revolt has lost a lot of its teeth. However, those familiar with modern warfare will know that we don't often exercise this destructive capacity. The main reason for this is because firing upon non-combatants is, rightfully, considered a no-no in the international community. But it's also because when the war is over, the people who won then have to rebuild and repair, and this is very hard to do if you've blown half the country's manufacturing capacity away. It's made even more difficult in a rebellion scenario, in which the losing side tends to stop existing after the war's over and sticks the winners with the entire bill. Naturally, the destructive capacity of modern militaries combined with the potential for sabotage means that there's a lot of opportunity in rebellions for the nation to get horribly crippled. Ergo, most governments' primary concern in the event of any kind of rebellion is going to be to end that crap as quickly and cheaply as possible. Cities are fairly expensive to build or repair and often contain important centers of commerce and transportation and other things that are either expensive or important or both and thus can't be destroyed when we need them, which means that in the event of a revolt, urban warfare is likely to be the name of the game. Now, urban warfare is a massive pain in the ass. There are all kinds of angles at play that pretty much can't be checked unanimously. You just gotta keep watching your back at all times. The verticality is crazy. It is laughably easy to get high ground on somebody in a city, and ultimately the net result is that every single building has to be checked individually from top to bottom to ensure that there's no one hiding in there waiting for you to turn your back, and only then can you move on. Whatever its original purpose may have been, the primary function of an armed populace nowadays is to ensure that the government never attempts to oppress its people militarily, because any attempt at such oppression would just be way too much of a pain in the ass for it to ever be worth it. The increased focus on cost assessment, though, can have a bit of an odd effect when combined with the shield against tyranny that a armed population is supposed to be. Specifically, it can result in a well-armed populace that is not surrounded by anything particularly important being considered too well-armed. Let me explain what I mean. I have heard with somewhat concerning frequency from the more enthusiastic supporters of gun rights that if the feds ever came for them and their guns, they would hold themselves up in their houses with all their weapons and all their bullets and fight to the last round. And while I'm sure that's a pleasantly self-aggrandizing notion, it's absolute nonsense. A commander in a rebellion scenario whose goal is to end the war quickly, and who has been given orders to that effect, when faced with you and your friends holed up and barricaded in your house with all your guns and bullets for days, is mostly just going to find themselves wondering why they should bother engaging you directly at all in attempting to drag you out of your house, when they can instead just lob a couple of high explosive shells into your living room, blow the house to the foundations, and free up their attention for stuff that the government actually cares about having to replace. Meanwhile, farming communities, mining communities, and other communities with some degree of relevant infrastructure within them can try to hold that hostage. The uh, problem with those kind of if we can't have it, neither can you tactics is they can very readily backfire. In all likelihood, them attempting to destroy or threatening to destroy the vital resource producing infrastructure will just result in their counterparts across the country getting bombed out of existence before they try the same tactic. And that assumes that attempting to destroy all of that resource producing infrastructure wasn't the government's plan to begin with, because the way that you make urban warfare less of a pain is by sieging the city and cutting off its supplies. The point, of course, is that north or south, east or west, urban or rural, and any other differences that you can think of, the people should always try to maintain some atmosphere of respect or at least mutual support. Because ultimately, your neighbor is the only one that can get your back. And the people in power would merrily blow you both to hell and starve all your friends to keep or regain their power. Never let them convince you otherwise, and never let them feel like they can stop trying to. The complete societal fracture, that last one, we saved it for last because it's not super likely to just happen of its own accord, but it's also a little unique because it's one of the more inevitable outcomes of any of the others. You remember earlier when Klein mentioned that the US is kind of too big to effectively govern? Funny thing about that is that while that problem has really only gotten worse over the years, it's kind of always been the case. And the point of the federal government was never really to rule it, per se. After the American Revolution, the states were pretty much capable of governing themselves. They all had their own general ideas about what they wanted to do with all of their newfound freedoms, and everything was, well, not peachy, but, you know, it was there. In any case, the people in charge looked at their positions of authority on the edge of a frontier, an entire ocean away from any known allies or enemies that could pose an actual military threat, and thought to themselves, someone should probably put together some kind of, like, friendly alliance before we all descend into infighting out of boredom, like Europe's been doing for the past, how long have we been a species? So, they set up an oversight body to help keep the states united in the face of threats and also, and kind of mainly, base greed. As we mentioned earlier, they did put some protections in place to keep this oversight body from getting too large and too domineering, but over the past couple of centuries, most of those precautions have been either ignored or removed, and we're left here with a rather bloated bureaucracy that labors under its own weight and is largely kept going by those who benefit from it, or are too worried that attempting to fix it will bring the whole thing tumbling down, which isn't an unfounded concern, but stasis isn't going to help anything either. But it's not all bad. The old machine is still chugging along, and we could probably fix it if the internal gremlins were willing to help us, and I feel like this metaphor is going to get away from me. So, the point is, it's not hopeless, the situation, it's just complicated. And next time, we'll try to explain how one can set up a government so that it lasts as long as possible and retains maximum salvageability. For now, please don't break anything, be kind to one another, and may your feet find garden paths. Nah, just kidding, we're not quite done yet. See, I wanted to make sure that this got out, before too much occurred, so I didn't have time to end up rambling as often as I usually do, which is probably actually a good thing. But the point is that there was a lot of stuff that I could have gone over that I didn't. It really cannot be overstated how bad a rebellion scenario of any kind would go for everyone involved. Like, probably the most significant one that I really didn't even bother touching on here is that there are a lot of corporations that could easily weigh in on the conflict, and as much as I would really love to avoid the United States Fall of Rome edition, being a citizen of the magical kingdoms of Disney sounds so much worse. Additionally, I would like to point out that as much as I would really, really love for a message of, you know, be nice to everybody and don't hurt people and so on to actually work, there are a lot of people, in fact, most of the people responsible for the raid on the Capitol, who do not share my definition of neighbor. And all I have to say to them is grow the fuck up. We're kind of way past any point where the people have any time for your bullshit, not that they ever did. You're kind of just embarrassing us all. Just stop it. Seriously. Not that I really expect them to listen to that either, but, you know. Anyway. Next time will be less grim, I hope. Certainly less complaining and more attempting satire by, you know, trying to adequately explain how a government should work. In any case, thanks for watching. And, you know, if you happen to find yourself a stone to stand on, don't jump off it. There's usually water under there. It's cold. Get your ankles wet. No, it's just life advice. No, I'm not mystical every time.